Day 1294 of the Ukrainian war map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia racks up more than 1,091,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 990 in the past day. Then as for hardware, 3 tanks, 1 APV, 29 artillery, a rocket launcher, and an estimated loss of 1.1 million barrels per day for Russia's locally produced refined fuel outputs. But more on that shortly, because now to the map, where Russian drones, including the Shahed-type Iranian drones, and up to 19 by current reports, violated Polish airspace in what marks an unprecedented escalation. The Russian drones flew deep into Polish airspace, with mixed reports on the range, but anywhere between 240 to 380 kilometers, with confirmations on reaching as far as the city of Łódź, some 100 kilometers southwest of the Polish capital of Warsaw, with several drones shot down by air defenses, with various wreckage scattered across the country. And it's an event that represents not just a security threat to Poland, as it also marks the first confirmed aerial engagement of Russian drones by a NATO country inside its own territory. And the response was not only Polish, with neutralization of the aerial threats also coming from NATO, as aircraft coming from the alliance was scrambled, with Dutch F-35s coming in under the alliance's policing mission, assisting with interceptions. Warsaw wasted little time in elevating the incident, with Prime Minister Donald Tusk denouncing the drone incursion as a large-scale provocation, and with the Polish government confirming it will invoke NATO's Article 4, a step short of the better-known Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause, with the current invocation to request allied consultations on threats to territorial integrity and security. It is a rare move, marking only the 8th time Article 4 has been invoked in NATO's 76-year history. As for the Kremlin response, Moscow's line was a mix of admission and denial. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov dodged questions, deflecting responsibility to the Russian Ministry of Defense, but not before dismissing NATO and EU accusations as routine, baseless provocations. As for Russia's MOD, well, they confirmed it had launched a large strike with long-range precision weapons and UAVs on Ukrainian defense industry sites, but those officials stressed that the drones they used, quote, do not exceed 700 kilometers in range, implying that most of their 2,500 kilometer range Russian drones are not capable of reaching Polish territory. It's also a statement that doesn't make a great deal of sense when also considering the multiple reports of some of these Russian drones entering from Belarusian airspace directly into Poland. Nonetheless, it was a case of Russia taking the approach of complete and utter denial, all the meanwhile offering consultations with Warsaw as a gesture of dialogue. The overall effect? Moscow admitted battering Ukraine, denied striking Poland, and leaned on ambiguity to preserve a so-called plausible deniability. Now, these shootdowns mark a doctrinal shift in the war, meaning that it's no longer contained to Ukraine's skies, but has now crossed notably deeper into NATO territory, with 6 Polish airspace violations since August 20th and nearly 20 drones involved overnight. Russia appears to be systematically testing NATO's air defenses. The scale and range of the activity of the Russian drones also suggests more than just a navigational drift, instead acting as a probe to measure response times, intercept tactics, allied cohesion, and above all, testing NATO's hard lines. So for NATO, the task now is to draw this line clearly, because treating the incursion as an accident only invites Moscow to repeat it. If violations are downplayed or excused, Russia would then read these types of actions as acceptable behavior, a green light to keep pushing boundaries. In fact, NATO General Secretary Mark Marotta, has labelled the Russian drone incursion into Polish airspace as reckless and dangerous an act, and where NATO has responded, ramping up its military posture, updating NATO's operational mechanisms, deploying additional Dutch F-35s and Polish F-16s for round-the-clock patrols along the eastern Polish borders. Now, Europe's response, while ferocious, so far lacks sufficient teeth, but where France's Macron, Italy's Meloni, and the EU's von der Leyen echoed the NATO General Secretary's condemnation, with Lithuania, Sweden, and the Czech Republic warning of Russia's escalating threat. Meanwhile, Russia's stance appears to be as transparent as ever: provoke, deny, repeat. But ultimately, NATO and Europe must draw a decisive boundary. The current military surge, bolstered patrols, missile defenses, and anti-drone tech is a start, but reactive measures won't ever really suffice. With Russia's probing that demands preemptive strength, including persistent surveillance, rapid response networks, and a clear signal that violations will face severe consequences. Anything less hands Moscow a green light to keep testing NATO's spine, pressing leaders into choices that will shape Europe's future security. Meanwhile, Z channels seem to be rejoicing. One example showed that they said Poles have gone into shaking mode, and another commented on how Russian attack drones are flying into Poland one after the other, and as it states, powerless NATO raises air force, quote unquote. So are they powerless, or are they raising their air force? Tough to make heads or tails of that one. Then next on the map, as this morning, Russian monitoring channels reported a storm shadow threat across Voronezh, Rostov, Belgorod, and the Krasnodar Krai regions of Russia. Though the storm shadow threat perhaps speaks more to their paranoia than anything, as we're not likely to ever see these Ukrainian-operated cruise missiles flying into those regions anytime soon. Still, NASA firms data showed a fire at a Russian military camp near Rajenskoye of Voronezh, and for a camp that has been well documented since before Russia's full-scale invasion, known for aiding Russian troops build up just beyond the Ukrainian border. Then to Kursk with a case of a Russian T-80 BVM variant of a main battle tank, just hanging back from the cross-border fight, as it laid there completely idle, getting roasted by FPVs in the process. And on occasion, like this one, you'll sometimes see those flames shoot right up out of the turret, following the tank's unprotected ammunition carousel becoming breached, leading to a hot series of detonations. Then, with several updates to be found on the main map today, starting off in the Toretsk direction, as the armed forces of Ukraine expelled the occupiers from the positions to the northwest of the town, and almost completely liberated Katerinivka. Then to the crossroads between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, Ukraine's defense forces continued their counter-offensive operations, with Russian troops driven out of the settlements of Pankivka, Mayak, Novotroitsk, and Ryazina, with Volodymyrivka under full Ukrainian control. The squeeze is definitely on for Russian elements west of the river. In fact, there's already been a number of freshly minted Russian POWs coming out of this sector in the past week, and chances are we'll see some more soon too. Then next, down on the map, where the AFU pushed marginally east of the edge of Donetsk on the Tolstoy front, taking a small amount of 1 square kilometer of territory north of the occupied settlement of Voskresenka. So overall, we see the AFU taking the initiative on the eastern front right now, and coming at a time when we hear numerous reports of Russia building up for a last battle this year. Although those reports have been going on for the last 3 or 4 weeks now. So just as it had become the case back in end of February, end of April, and around the June time, with their offensives largely falling flat, they better get a move on because it's September 10th already. Then, somewhere in the east, another scrap metal road of death, taken from the perspective of a Russian soldier in the Desert Cross Buggy series of their ATVs. Seen in the footage is a combination of cars, trucks, and heavy armor disposed of by the AFU. Now, interestingly, at one moment of the video, a pickup truck pulls up, coming in from the left, headed in the same direction as the Desert Cross. Then, after a couple of minutes, the crew pulls over to fire at and take cover from drones heard and seen in the sky. Then after getting out of that little incident unscathed, They get back in their vehicle, continue the drive, then just a couple of minutes after that, they come across what appears to be the same vehicle they just saw earlier. In front of them, destroyed by what you can only assume to be another inbound FPV. So, as always, driving through roads like these surely cannot instill any level of confidence in passerbys. Then to follow up from the start of the video, with an estimated loss of 1.1 million barrels per day for Russia's locally produced refined fuel outputs. Now, as a rough guide, before the war, and before Ukraine's UAVs turned many a Russian oil refinery into smoking refineries, Russia had produced around 3.8 million barrels per day in refined fuels for their domestic consumption. A level needed to keep the country running in normal mode, armies fed with diesel, farmers with tractors, and city dwellers with a steady stream of gasoline at the pump. But refinery strikes have steadily eroded that lifeline, with the 1.1 million barrels per day of refined capacity being smashed or sidelined, slicing off more than just a fraction of Russia's refined fuels output. Now, it is true to say that Russia has an additional fuel production in barrels per day on top of this 3.8 million figure, but that's tied up with export contracts and equally a source of revenue for the Kremlin. So it puts their domestic consumption in a precarious position. So as it stands, we could be looking at Russia's 3.8 million barrels per day in supply needs being met by just 2.7 million barrels per day. That's enough to keep the lights on, somewhat, and so to speak. At that level, military logistics and agriculture can limp along, but it's where civilian gasoline starts to evaporate. Gas stations run dry in provincial towns, food shipments slow, and the black market starts to take over. And then, beneath these figures, lies the so-called survival floor. Then below 1.6 million barrels per day, the risk of economic collapse seriously looms. It's where freight grinds to a crawl, farmers are stranded without fuel and on the edge of bankruptcy, and even the armed forces start to compete with the civilian economy for every last drop available. That will be where gas station queues will be stretching around city blocks, groceries run late to the shops, and the public begin to question whether Moscow can actually deliver stability while waging war abroad. Quite the dilemma, given that the Kremlin narrative is one of Putin being re-voted into leadership over the past 25 years, as he can guarantee stability for the country. And yet, we're already seeing earlier signs of gas station queues running wild throughout various regions of the country, including the capital itself. The Kremlin is already trying to plug holes with refined fuel imports from Iran, Kazakhstan, Belarus and Turkey, but best case scenario is that accounts for somewhere between 200 to 400,000 additional barrels per day, which only represents a small portion of Russia's needs, because Iran, for instance, faces its own shortfalls of refined outputs. But let's just say, even if it had millions of barrels to supply to Russia, it would utilize the Caspian Sea shipping route, which is out of question due to its shallow depth, with zero option for supertankers and their corresponding infrastructure to exist. So Russia would be lucky to get 100,000, maybe even 70,000 barrels per day from Iran, which is a minuscule figure for their needs. Beyond that, Kazakhstan and Belarus have to also largely serve their own domestic needs first, leaving just a small trickle available for leftover Russian consumption. And then there's Turkey, which is more of a case of geopolitical risk for the country and charging dearly for anything Russia is optioned to buy. So ultimately, for Russia, the story unfolding right now is one of a very risky situation. So if Ukrainian strikes on Russia's oil refinery facilities continues at the most recent pace, then Russia is headed for survival minimums and collapse risk, where no amount of propaganda can substitute for diesel or automotive gasoline at the pump. These are some serious times. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!